Visitors to the British Museum in London can soon find themselves face to face with objects both unfamiliar and unsettling. Among these, one in particular has an enduring power to ensnare the imagination. In the British Museum's Mexican Gallery reside some of the institution's most mysterious artifacts. These are relics of vanished civilizations that we can never fully understand. The most prized object here is perhaps the most beautiful and the most mysterious. A double-headed serpent made in Aztec times from turquoise mosaic.
The double-headed serpent encapsulates a lot of the enigmas and contradictions of Aztec culture. I like to think of it sometimes as both a fierce and beautiful world.
I find it very chilling because no matter how much your eye might run and run and run around these shapes, it's always led in the end to those teeth, and those teeth absolutely mean depth.
To see two serpent heads and to have them in this precious material, the color of water makes it unique.
People like the symmetry, the beauty, the color. It has a vibrancy and an energy which I think carries just as well today as it did in Aztec times.
It is at once alluring and disquieting. The double-headed mosaic serpent is over 500 years old, but even in a darkened gallery, it still glitters and sparkles. Its original home was probably the city of Tenochtitlan, the extraordinary capital of the Aztec Empire.
Well, the Aztec civilization is tremendously sophisticated, even by modern standards. They have wonderful masonry and architecture, they're advanced astronomers, even in some ways their medicine's quite advanced, and the capital city reflects all of those things. It's a tremendous city on an island in the middle of an enormous lake. It's in some ways a modern version of Venice, with straight canals running alongside straight streets.
Tenochtitlan no longer exists, and the serpent survives only by chance. Ironically, the destroyers of the city were perhaps the saviors of the serpent. The Spanish conquistadors made landfall in Mexico in March 1519, led by Hernán Cortés.
When the Europeans and the Americans confronted each other for the first time, this was really almost like aliens arriving from Mars. It was the only time in our recorded history that we know of this undiscovered world being contacted and being explored, and both cultures coming into contact with one another. And I think an object like the turquoise mosaic in many ways represents the gulf between those two worlds.
When Hernán Cortés arrived in ancient Mexico, the Aztecs thought that he might be a returning god. They sent precious gifts to him, perhaps including the double-headed serpent.
It's certainly possible that something like this could have been given to Cortés. Turquoise is something incredibly valued by the Aztecs, and it's a beautiful piece of workmanship, something that they might have wanted to give to the Spanish to show their craftsmanship. That said, it's not the kind of thing that Cortés tends to be as interested in. He's really very keen on the gold.
Cortés had his gifts shipped back to Europe as mere curiosities. His eye was on a prize no less than a kingdom. The conquistadors' fatal mix of Christian fervor and personal avarice meant that within 2 years, the Aztec civilization had been added to the roll call of lost cultures. Never again would an object like the double-headed serpent be produced. Mexico is home to over 700 species of snake. For the Aztecs, these graceful and deadly creatures had great mystical significance.
The serpent is a very important symbol in Mexican history. It's the symbol of regeneration, it's the symbol of fertility par excellence in ancient Mexico. The serpent shedded skin, and of course it made the symbol of a new life, a new regeneration of the earth. It was symbolic of the earth, it was symbolic of blood. The serpent appeared in every art.
One of the most striking and fearsome Aztec artworks that survives is the 8-foot-high statue of the goddess Coatlicue, or the serpent-skirted one. Her arms and belt are serpents, and her head is made up of 2 giant snakes. Like the serpent-skirted one, the British Museum's double-headed serpent is clearly no zoological specimen, but it does have roots in the real world.
The Aztecs were keen observers of nature. We can see this in the wonderful sculpted stone image of the naturalistic snake. With a double-headed serpent, the possible inspiration may lie in the observation of snakes in nature when they're either mating or fighting, intertwining, and producing an image of one body and 2 heads.
And the image of a double-headed serpent also had well-established symbolic meanings for the Aztecs.
The idea of a double-headed serpent occurs first among the Maya, perhaps, in the form of a soul bar, which is just a bar held by a ruler to his chest. And I think originally either end was a white lily. Over time, this developed into a double-headed serpent, which was associated with the sky and the idea of the ruler communicating with the sky through this bar.
The double-headed mosaic serpent might then have been used by Moctezuma, the last independent ruler of the Aztec Empire. This symbol of wealth, power, and divinity would have been displayed by him during religious ceremonies.
The double-headed serpent has suspension loops visible in the wooden frame at the back. And so clearly it must either have been suspended, possibly as a pectoral worn across the chest, or perhaps attached to something and displayed as a badge of office. One has to imagine that the objects are deployed together with a rich array of other costumery and ritual regalia that together would have given a very vivid sense of quite possibly reenactments of creation stories, analogous, one might imagine, to the medieval English mystery plays, where sacred events are enacted out in view of the public audience.
Worn by a ruler in these religious ceremonies, the serpent might have called to mind for the Aztecs one of their most important gods, Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent.
Quetzalcoatl, whose name translates as Quetzal-feathered serpent, was a deity sometimes associated with the wind, but more often with the sky. And the association between the double-headed serpent and this god is perhaps also made through the colour turquoise, which is very reminiscent of the daytime sky.
Now, half a millennium after it was made, scientists in the British Museum are subjecting the serpent to the closest possible scrutiny, an attempt to better understand the physical reality that underlies its mystical charge. The main material used in making the serpent was turquoise, and microscopic analysis of the tiny tiles, or tesserae, shows just how skilled the Aztecs' working of that stone was.
When viewed at high magnification under the optical microscope, the detail of the way that the individual tesserae on the object were worked is immediately obvious. We see grinding marks going in different directions on adjacent tesserae, showing how they were polished before they were put in place. Another very interesting feature is beveling of the individual tesserae. This would have been very important to achieve that mirror-like surface finish that we see on the serpent.
The serpent drew on the resources of a vast empire. The turquoise was imported from what is now the southern United States, well over 1,000 miles away. The white conch shell of the fangs was brought overland from the Gulf of Mexico. And the red shell of the gums and nose was gathered by deep-water divers as far away as South America. Once safely in the Aztec capital, these were all fixed onto a base of wood, hollowed out to form a U-shape. The expert craftsman would have known that scooped-out wood was less likely to shrink and crack, thereby loosening the precious tiles. Those tiles were fixed to the wood using a resin obtained from local trees. Known to the Aztecs as copal, it had a symbolic meaning as well as a practical use.
Well, the copal resin was especially valued because it was used as an offering in incense burners. And there's both a wonderfully evocative visual image that's conjured up of the serpentine wreaths of smoke coming from such incense burners, and an all-pervasive aromatic smell, a perfume that would have pervaded the interiors of temples and been very strongly associated in people's minds with their experience of the rituals and ceremonies in which it was used.
On the rear of the serpent, there are traces of gilding, indicated that it might once have been covered in gold leaf. And around the empty eye sockets are traces of beeswax, a fixative. This suggests that the serpent originally had eyes, perhaps of polished pyrite, a silvery black stone, like the Aztec skull mask, also in the British Museum. And this isn't the only feature that might originally have been different.
The holes under the jaw are intriguing. They're surrounded by tesserae that are clearly original and part of the original mosaicing design, so they're an original feature of the object, and something must have been threaded through there. It's tempting to speculate that there may have been some kind of tongue fashioned inside each mouth of the serpent, and that maybe this was a movable feature. If the object was used or worn, these might have moved around. Perhaps there were strings through the holes that would have enabled somebody wearing the object as a pectoral to move the tongues themselves.
The double-headed serpent was one of the supreme achievements of a culture that stretched back thousands of years. But even as it was being made, the destruction of that culture was imminent.
The encounter between the Aztecs and the Spanish, which occurs with the arrival of the conquistadors, really is a tremendous encounter. It's perhaps the only occasion in history when we see what we'd see as a truly modern civilization meeting a truly ancient one. And it's a great shock for both sides. Even the Spanish you've seen, people on the outlying islands, are totally unprepared for the great civilization which they encounter when they get to the Valley of Mexico.
Into the Aztec world, which lacked iron, gunpowder, horses, and even the wheel, came a tiny but technologically advanced alien presence. To the bewildered Aztecs, the conquistadors' ships were towers in the sea, and their horses tame deer. And there was even the possibility that Hernán Cortés, the leader of the conquistadors, might not be human, but an incarnation of a familiar god.
Quetzalcoatl as a culture hero is said to have disappeared towards the east when in fact Cortés and the bearded foreigners arrived on the shores of the Gulf of Mexico in the early 16th century. It was perceived as being a manifestation of the return of the deity Quetzalcoatl.
Perhaps believing Cortés to be Quetzalcoatl, the Aztec emperor Moctezuma sent ambassadors bearing precious gifts to greet him. A prestigious piece such as the double-headed serpent might well have been amongst this treasure. But the Spaniard was more likely to have been horrified than impressed by some of the objects presented to him.
The Aztec art of this particular period is completely unlike anything going on elsewhere. What I think is very frightening about their art is that it has no interest in the individual at all. It doesn't commemorate great triumphs. It doesn't commemorate great leaders. There are no statues of powerful figures who conquered. The colonizers are never commemorated. There are no intimate portraits. There are no portraits at all, in fact. There are no images of women and babies. There are no images of children. There's nothing tender. Everything is looking towards death.
And death is what awaited the Aztecs. For although Cortés accepted their gifts, his ambition was not so easily sated. Within 2 years, the conquistadors had effectively destroyed the city of Tenochtitlan and the Aztec Empire. The body of the Emperor Moctezuma was cast into a river.
It is a society they totally fail to comprehend. The bloody sacrificial rituals horrify them, and they react very violently against that. People are forced to march out of the city in long lines. They're searched to check they don't have any gold on them. They're branded in some cases if they're believed to have been resisting. So at the end of the conquest itself, there's an almost utter destruction of a lot of the essentials of the Aztec civilization. And 10 years after the conquest, something like 90% of the indigenous population of Mexico have died of disease or from war.
All this happened to us. We saw it, we marveled at it. With this sad and mournful destiny, we saw ourselves afflicted. Gold, jade, precious raiment, quetzal feathers, everything once of value has become nothing.
Some objects, the serpent among them, survived the destruction to make it back to Europe. They were curiosities, examples of the exotic, but there were those who valued their artistry. The German artist Albrecht Dürer saw a selection of the treasures in Hamburg in 1520 and wrote,
I saw the things that were brought from the new land of gold, and in all the days of my life I have seen nothing which so rejoiced my heart. For I saw among them strange and exquisitely worked objects, and marvelled at the subtle genius of the men in distant lands. The things I saw there, I had no words to express.
Even today, the double-headed serpent has the power to impress artists. Stephen Gregory has worked in mosaics, and he is attempting to unlock the secrets of the craftsmanship that so impressed Dürer.
There's this turquoise from southwestern America called Sleeping Beauty, Navajo, which is the same kind of turquoise that was used by the Aztecs. And it's a very pure, tight-grained, nice-coloured turquoise. Of the two methods of cutting or changing the shape of the turquoise, the simplest method would be to smash it with another stone and shatter it into smaller pieces that can then be worked into the finished tiles that they used.
These turquoise fragments could then have been glued onto a block of wood using a natural adhesive and sanded down until flat. Pieces of the same size would then be glued together to form blocks large enough to cut into perfect shapes using flint knives. Once cut, the glue would be dissolved in hot water to release the perfect and identical tiles.
This is not a stone that would have given them huge problems. The things that I think would have given them problems is simply the scale, that they're working with really minute pieces. Some of the pieces on the Serpent are mind-bogglingly small. They'd obviously have tweezers because you physically can't get in to pick some of these minute things up. Fish bones would be perfect. When you're going into two concaves or a convex, like going into a cleavage and trying to stick a tiny piece of stone inside there and then polish it is, to me, quite mind-boggling for when they were doing it.
The mosaic of the double-headed serpent is made up of a mixture of carefully cut tiles and tiny random ones. They were stuck down carefully onto a bed of sticky copal resin.
If you have enough pieces, you can fit them together, like this selection here. So it's like a jigsaw puzzle. If you have enough pieces, you'll manage to actually put them together. They will look as if they've all been cut as exact fits, but in actual fact, they're pretty randomly chosen, and it's just a matter of arranging them and being nice and careful. And you do have the facility of rubbing them down to be able to get an exact fit. If they had a team of people working on something like the Serpent, it would probably have taken 6 months to make the Serpent. But if I was actually having to create all the tiles in the way they did, it would be an open-ended situation of probably a couple of years.
The amazing skill of the Aztec craftsmen was not always appreciated, though. As late as the 19th century, some of the mosaics that had reached Europe were regarded as having little value beyond their raw materials.
The turquoise mosaics have undergone some subtle but very interesting shifts in terms of how they were perceived. Some were found in a jeweler's workshop in the 19th century in Florence and in Italy, where the jeweler was picking them apart, valuing the material, the turquoise tesserae or tiles, but barely seeing or registering the object at all.
By chance, the double-headed serpent evaded the mosaic butchers. It was perhaps languishing forgotten in a private collection, and so it remained a hidden treasure until public taste was more attuned to its beauty.
I think the 19th century is really a pivotal moment because that's when Europe really, for the first time, manages to cast its eyes over the riches and the wonders of the Spanish New World. They've seen potatoes and tomatoes and tobacco and all these other wonderful produce that they'd never really known before. And so they're all curious to find out what their opportunities are. I mean, let's face it, most people are interested in how they can make their own fortunes out of the opening up of the frontiers.
One of the first entrepreneurs to get over to the newly independent Mexico was William Bullock, a Liverpool-based jeweler turned showman. He returned from his perilous adventures in the New World with an impressive haul, some genuine Aztec artifacts, some specially made copies, and some human beings. He put all of these on display in his famous museum, known as the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly.
The exhibition really comprised of many different things, including waxwork models of contemporary Mexican rural inhabitants, casts of extraordinary kind of Aztec monuments, in particular the calendar stone, the large sculpture of Kurt Liquet. And he also had this extraordinary, enormous coiled serpent with a man inside its open, gaping mouth. This is not something that's known to archaeologists and art historians to have existed. So quite where he got the idea from, or conjured up the idea for creating this thing, is not really known.
Despite, or perhaps because of, Bullock's fabrications, Aztec fever took a hold of the British public. Before long, so-called real-life Aztecs shipped over from Mexico were even being displayed to Queen Victoria at Buckingham Palace. When Bullock's show was over, the British Museum bought a selection of the sculptures as the basis of its Mexican collection. But the star exhibit was still in hiding. It finally emerged in Italy in the 1890s, where a noblewoman, the Duchessa Massimo, was keen to profit from the public's growing hunger for the lost world of the Aztecs. The Italian Duchess wrote in French to the British Museum. Her comments were perhaps typical of the attitudes of her time.
The Mexican serpent has reached me in good condition. It's very curious, though I wouldn't say that it is beautiful.
The Duchess was after £120 for the object. The British Museum offered £100 to have it sent on approval, and she reluctantly accepted. The serpent had finally found a loving home, and in a new century, it would find an ever more appreciative audience.
It looks like the most stylish piece of jewellery you've ever seen. I mean, you could imagine Coco Chanel really being very, very pleased with this creation had she manufactured it. It's not a friendly work like a Fabergé egg. It's not a friendly piece of jewellery at all. It's hard, and it's a machine-age work, and it's not surprising that double-headed serpents appear, for example, in Art Deco. And I think that many of those do have some sort of affiliation with this one.
I think the chords that it strikes with people today is really in trying to understand our own humanity. What is the trajectory of human development? What are the sources of life? What is our relationship to the deities? Human questions that are of concern to all of us.
The serpent today sits in isolated splendor, as alluring and enigmatic as ever. For all the research, the analysis, and the interpretation, it will never reveal all of its secrets. Its scaled, shining surface seems to reflect our questions back at us.
In some ways, we're looking at this object with the eyes that the Spanish did. They didn't understand it, they didn't know its significances. They could try and find out, they could try and look into it. But in some ways, it had the same mystery for the Spanish in the 16th century that it has for us now.